She borrowed her sister's torn gown, unaware the Alpha King had already chosen her. Her grandmother used to say, "A thing that is truly gold does not ask to be recognized. It simply waits for the right light." Saren Ashvale had grown up turning that saying over in her hands like a river stone, smooth from handling. She had never been certain whether it was comfort or caution, whether it promised that worth would eventually find its moment, or warned that some gold spent a lifetime buried in the dark and no light ever came. She was 22 years old, wolfless in a world of wolves, and she had not yet decided which it was. Chapter 1. The Gown. The rite of presentation happened once a generation. Every unmated Omega woman in the territory of Veldenmoor was required to attend the Crescent Court, to stand before the Alpha King and be formally acknowledged. It was not a marriage auction. That was what the High Council insisted, loudly, whenever anyone dared suggest otherwise. It was a ceremony of dignity, they said, a recognition of every woman's place within the pack hierarchy. Saren had heard her sister Kala explain it differently. "It's where he picks," Kala had said, inspecting her own reflection with frank satisfaction. "And this year he will pick me." Kala was beautiful in the way of a sharpened blade, precise, luminous, impossible to look away from. She had her wolf. She had the silver blonde hair that their mother had also carried. She had 3 suitors already, and she treated each of them like an inconvenience she hadn't yet gotten around to discarding. Saren had brown hair that couldn't decide whether it wanted to curl or wave, broad shoulders from years of hauling water at the mill where she worked, and no wolf. She had never shifted, never felt the second heartbeat that every other shifter described, that warm, animal throb behind the sternum. The pack healers had examined her 3 times and offered 3 different explanations, each more dismissive than the last. Wolfless, they'd finally written in the registry. Incomplete shift, designation, Omega, status, unmanifested. She was required to attend the rite regardless. The law did not make exceptions for wolfless women. The problem of what to wear had presented itself that morning with blunt finality. Saren's one formal dress had been ruined at the mill last week. A pulley mechanism had caught the skirt and torn it beyond saving. She had not told her mother because her mother would have wept and then reminded Saren how much it had cost, in that particular order. Kala's discarded gown was hanging on the back of the wardrobe door. Ivory silk, empire-waisted, with seed pearls around the collar, a dress that had cost more than Saren earned in 2 months. It was last season's, Kala said. She wouldn't be caught in it, and it had a tear along the left hem where Kala had caught it on a garden fence the previous spring. "You can have it if you like," Kala had said that morning, not looking up from her mirror. "It's not as if he's going to notice you." Saren had taken the gown without a word. She had spent the afternoon mending the torn hem with thread that did not quite match, dark ivory against cream, and pressing the silk with the flat iron until it lay smooth. The pearls were cool against her fingers. The dress was made for someone shorter and narrower across the shoulders, so the seams pulled slightly at her arms, and the hem, even mended, sat 3 inches higher on her than it was meant to. She stood in the small, cracked mirror in her room and studied herself. She did not look like she belonged in a gown like this. But she looked, she thought, like herself, which was something. She tucked the small spool of mismatched mending thread into her coat pocket before she left. She was not sure why. Something about finishing what she'd started. Chapter 2. The Crescent Court. Veldenmoor's Crescent Court occupied the highest ridge of the valley, built from pale granite that went rose gold at dusk. Saren had seen it from a distance her entire life, the banners, the towers, the torchlight that spilled from the great windows on ceremonial nights. Up close, it was noisier than she'd imagined. Hundreds of women in silks and velvets moved through the outer courtyard like a tide of color, their wolves visible as silver and gold auras that pulsed faintly beneath their skin. Saren kept to the edges. The great hall was hung with white birch branches and the blue-black flowers of the moonshade vine. Sconces burned with pale flame. The floor was black stone, polished to a mirror depth, and when Seren looked down, she could see herself reflected back. The borrowed gown, the mismatched hem, her dark hair pinned up with the 2 bone combs that had been her grandmother's. She found her assigned place in the lower tier of the presentation floor, the position given to wolfless and low-standing omegas, well away from the elevated dais where Kala and the other high-register women stood in their new gowns like a garden in full bloom. The Alpha King had not yet arrived. Seren studied the room. She noticed the way the high-standing women arranged themselves with unconscious precision, angling their best features toward the dais. She noticed a young woman near her who was weeping quietly and trying to hide it. New to the territory, probably, brought here without family. Seren touched her arm and passed her the folded handkerchief she kept in her coat pocket, the one she'd taken out when she'd put the thread in. "The young woman, Dova," she whispered, clutched it with both hands. Then the great doors opened. Chapter 3. The king, Aldrich Voss, was not what Seren had expected. She had built a king in her imagination from the pieces she'd gathered over the years. A large man, probably cold-faced, probably armored in ceremony and distance. What walked through the doors was something both more and less than that. He was tall, that much was accurate. Dark-haired, broad through the chest, wearing a coat the color of midnight with silver at the collar. But he moved with a quiet deliberateness that was more watchful than martial. His face was not cold. It was careful. There was a difference. Cold faces refused to register. Careful ones were always registering, always filing away what they saw. He was filing away the room right now. His eyes, amber, almost wolfen, even in the human form, moved through the crowd with an efficiency that had nothing theatrical about it. He was not performing his own importance. He was actually looking. Seren felt the exact moment his gaze touched her section of the floor. It moved over the lower tier the way it had moved over everything else, systematically, without the dismissal she'd expected. She had assumed a king would skim the wolfless section. Most high-standing wolves did. Their eyes found what registered in the hierarchy and slid off what didn't. His gaze did not slide. It moved, and then it stopped. She could not be certain it had stopped on her specifically. The lower tier held 40 women, but she felt it. A sensation like sunlight striking cold stone, sudden warmth in a specific place. Her grandmother's saying ran through her mind unbidden. It simply waits for the right light, and she pushed it down, because she was not a woman who built hope out of a glance. The ceremony began. Names were called. Women ascended to the dais, were formally acknowledged by the High Council, and descended. Kala's name was called in the second wave, the High Register presentation, and she moved to the dais with the practiced grace of someone who had been rehearsing for years. She was luminous. Everyone could see it. Several of the High Council members nodded with the appreciative solemnity of men recognizing an expected outcome. The Alpha King watched Kala with the same careful attention he'd given everyone else. No more. No less. When the lower-tier names were called, most of the hall had resumed its soft, conversational murmur. The wolfless and unmanifested presentations were officially a formality. Seren Ashval, she walked to the dais. Chapter 4, The Thread. She was 3 steps from the top when the mended hem caught. The staircase to the dais had a small decorative nailhead protruding from the edge of the second-to-last step. A minor architectural negligence that would have caught no one's attention if it hadn't snagged precisely the section of Seren's hem that she had restitched that afternoon. She felt the thread give, heard the faint whisper of it pulling free, and then the hem sagged on her left side, dropping unevenly. She did not fall. She caught herself on the rail with one hand, steady, quiet, no dramatic stumble, and she straightened and walked the final 2 steps and stood before the High Council as if nothing had happened. In the hall below, she heard Kala make a small sound that was not quite a laugh. The High Counselor read from his ledger, Seren Ashvale, wolfless, unmanifested, lower designation. He looked at her over the ledger with the expression of a man performing a task that offended his sense of proportion. Acknowledged. That was all the wolfless ones received. No long ceremonial address. Acknowledged, and stepped down. She reached into her coat pocket. Her fingers found the spool of thread, the dark ivory against cream, the practical little spool she'd used to fix the gown this afternoon. She didn't know why she took it out. Habit, perhaps, or some instinct that keeping her hands busy was the only way to hold her expression steady. She turned to descend. Wait! The voice came from the dais's left wing, where the Alpha King had been standing in stillness throughout the lower-tier presentations. Every head in the hall turned. Aldrich Voss walked to the center of the dais. He was looking at her, not at the hall, not at the High Council. At her. You mended that hem yourself. It was not a question. She met his eyes. This morning, my lord. The thread wasn't a perfect match. I'm aware. Before the most significant ceremony of the season. He was still studying her, that careful, filing quality to his gaze, the quality she'd noticed from across the room. You could have found another gown. This was the gown available to me. She kept her voice even. I made it work with what I had. Something shifted in his expression. Not softened exactly, deepened. The nail on the second step has been reported to the stewards 3 times this year. He said it to the High Counselor as much as to her, and there was something in the quiet of it that made the counselor go slightly pale. Then he looked back at Seren, and his voice changed registers. Lower, more direct, stripped of the formality. What is in your hand? She looked down at the spool. Thread. The kind I used for the mending. She couldn't have said why she held it up. It seemed the honest answer to an honest question. The hall was very quiet. I'd like to speak with you, Aldrich Voss said, when the ceremony concludes. Chapter 5. What Calla Said. The ceremony concluded. Women gathered in clusters, talking with their families, receiving refreshments. Calla found Seren in the antechamber where a servant had directed her to wait, and she looked, for the first time in Seren's memory, uncertain. What did you say to him? Her voice had a brightness to it that was close but not quite to her usual sharp confidence. The brightness of someone recalculating. He asked about the hem. I told him the truth. Calla looked at the gown, her old gown, mended with the wrong thread, sitting slightly too wide at the shoulders. It didn't even fit you properly. No, the thread doesn't match. I know. A silence fell between them, and in it, Seren watched her sister rearrange something in her understanding of the evening. The way you'd rearrange furniture in a room where you'd always assumed things had to stand in particular places. You don't have a wolf, Calla said finally. It wasn't cruel exactly. It sounded more like she was reciting a fact she was now confused by, a mathematical certainty that had given the wrong answer. I know that too. Seren looked at her sister, really looked, with the same fullness she'd felt under the Alpha King's gaze, and she felt something that was not resentment and not forgiveness either, but simply a clear-eyed understanding. Calla had been given so much and had learned to lead with all of it, because leading with the things you'd been given was the only strategy she knew. It had seemed, until tonight, like the only strategy that worked. He sent for you, Calla said, as if saying it aloud one more time might make it cohere. Yes. A servant appeared in the doorway. My Lady Ashvale, the Alpha King is ready. Seren smoothed the uneven hem with one hand, tucked the spool of thread back into her pocket, and followed. Chapter 6. The Garden. He had chosen a small walled garden off the east wing for the meeting. A practical choice, she thought. It had exits. It was not the closed intimacy of a private room, and the presence of 2 discreet guards at the archway made the propriety irreproachable. He had thought about her comfort. She noticed that. He was standing at the center of the garden when she arrived, the torchlight making his dark coat absorb the shadows. Up close, without the ceremony framing him, he was more human-shaped. She could see the small scar through his left eyebrow, and that his hands were not a king's soft hands. They were calloused, worked. You're not afraid of me, he said. It was the first thing he said, and he said it with a quality that was closer to relief than observation. Should I be? Most people are. They stand differently. They don't make eye contact for more than 2 seconds at a time. He looked at her steadily. You look at me like I'm a person. You appear to be one. Something crossed his face that she was almost certain was a smile, working very hard not to fully exist yet. Saren Ashvale, the registry says wolfless. It does. That troubles you. She considered the honest answer. It used to trouble me more than it does now. Now it's more like a room in my house where the light doesn't reach. I've learned which furniture is in it. I don't walk into the walls anymore. He was quiet for a moment. A real quiet. Not a waiting to speak quiet. My wolf chose your scent the moment I entered the hall tonight, he said. I want you to know that I'm telling you this directly, without ceremony, because I think you are a person who prefers direct things. Saren felt the world do something peculiar. Not rearrange exactly, but illuminate. As if a lamp had been brought into that dark room. Your wolf is certain. I am not yet asking you to be certain. What I am asking is whether you are willing to know me. He paused. I've presided over 8 rites of presentation. I have not sent for anyone until tonight. She turned the information over carefully. A king who had waited. A wolf that chose on instinct older than rank or registry. A man who had noticed the thread didn't match and asked about it as if it mattered, because he understood that the mending was a story. You understand, she said slowly, that I may never shift, that I may remain wolfless. My wolf doesn't seem to consider that the relevant information. And you? He held her gaze. I think a woman who mends a borrowed gown with mismatched thread on the morning of the highest ceremony in the territory, because it's the gown available to her, and she will make it work, is a woman I would very much like to understand better. The garden smelled of moonshade vine and cold stone, and the particular green dark scent of late autumn. Her grandmother's saying came back to her again. It simply waits for the right light. And this time, she did not push it down. I'm willing to know you, she said. Chapter 7. Months. What followed was not a fairy tale in the clean, straight-spined way of fairy tales. It was complicated and slow and better for being both of those things. The High Council objected, formally in writing, 3 times. A wolfless woman, an unmanifested omega with no family rank and a mill laborer's history. They used delicate language for indelicate meanings, and Aldrich read every letter with the same careful attention he gave everything, and then set them aside. Calla came to Saren in the 3rd week, and this time there was no brightness that wasn't confidence in her voice. She was quieter than Saren had ever heard her. She sat in Saren's small room at the mill cottage and looked at the cracked mirror and said simply, I think I've been looking at you wrong for a very long time. It was not an elaborate apology. It was perhaps the beginning of the real one, the kind that doesn't arrive fully formed but grows, slowly, into something genuine. Saren visited the Crescent Court twice weekly through the winter months, and each visit built on the one before. She learned that Aldrich had been 9 years old when his father died, and had administered his first territorial dispute at 11. She learned that he kept the council's objection letters specifically because rereading them reminded him what sycophancy looked like. A reference point, he said, so he'd always be able to identify it. She learned that he made tea himself in the mornings, because it was the one ordinary task no one had ever tried to take from him. He learned that she had been mending things since she was a child, clothes, tools, the small structural damages that poverty leaves in its wake, and that she had never framed this as lack. He learned that her grandmother had given her 2 bone combs and a saying, and that the saying had lived in her hands like a stone for 22 years, while she waited to know what it meant. He learned that she was funny, quietly, precisely funny, in a way that made his careful face do the thing it had done in the garden. A smile working its way up from somewhere genuine. Her wolf, when it came, came quietly. It was a Tuesday in late February, unremarkable in every other way. She was in the mill courtyard when she felt it, that second heartbeat, that warm animal throb behind her sternum that she'd heard described her entire life and stopped expecting. It rose through her like light rising through water. When she shifted for the first time, alone in the courtyard with the snow coming down in fat, slow flakes, she was a wolf the color of river stone after rain. Dark, gray-brown, neither silver nor gold, entirely itself. She stood in the snow and breathed the world through an entirely new instrument. She did not run to the Crescent Court. She sat with it. She let it be hers, privately, for a whole hour before she told anyone. When she told Aldrich, he did not say, "I knew it," or "you see." He simply looked at her with that deep, registering gaze and said, "How did it feel?" "Like something that was always mine coming home," she said. He took her hand, the first time, a simple, direct gesture, and held it. Chapter 8. The Choosing. The formal declaration came in March, on the first warm day, when the moonshade vine began to bud along the Crescent Court's garden wall. Aldrich made it before the High Council and did not couch it in diplomatic language or strategic framing. He stated it plainly. Seren Ashvale, who was wolfless when he chose her, and who had since manifested in her own time and her own way, would be his mate and his queen. The High Council received this with the expression of men watching a mathematical certainty give the wrong answer. Seren stood beside him and did not smooth her dress, or modify her posture, or angle herself for the room. She stood the way she'd stood on the dais in the borrowed gown, upright, present herself. The oldest counselor, a man named Prevent, who had written 2 of the 3 formal objections, looked at her for a long moment. She thought he was going to say something cutting or dismissive, something in the delicate language that meant indelicate things. Instead, he said stiffly but not insincerely, "The Alpha King's wolf does not err." It was not a welcome exactly, but it was a door opening. Afterward, in the garden, she and Aldrich stood in the early March light, with the cold still in the air and the first green coming up through the dark soil. She had the spool of thread in her pocket. She had taken to carrying it the way some people carry lucky coins, for the ballast of the ordinary in extraordinary places. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "No." She considered it honestly. "I'm waiting to know what it becomes." His wolf was in his eyes, warm amber with the gold of something very old and certain, and he looked at her the way the right light looks at gold. "So am I," he said. "But I am not afraid of the waiting." She leaned into him. The moonshade vine budded around them, the patient, persistent thing that bloomed in every season, but chose spring to show it. Epilogue, 1 year later. Spring again. The Crescent Court's garden had the moonshade vine in full deep blue bloom, and the granite had gone rose gold in the afternoon light, and Seren, who was Queen of Veldenmoor, who had been queen for 4 months, and was still learning what she meant to the word, was sitting on the low stone bench with her boots off, and her feet in the new grass, which was cool and entirely undignified, and completely fine. She had a small wooden box in her lap, the kind meant for jewelry, though she kept it for different things. Inside it, her grandmother's 2 bone combs, worn smooth from a lifetime of use, and a small spool of thread. Dark ivory against cream, noticeably mismatched, still 3/4 full. The mended gown was in the court's archive now, at her own specific request. She had given it to the head archivist with instructions that the description read, "Gown, ivory silk, seed-pearled collar with alterations. Original hem mended with mismatched thread, morning of the 44th rite of presentation." This was the gown available. She made it work. The archivist had looked at her curiously, and she had explained only, "For anyone who comes here and needs to know, that is enough." Dova, the young woman who had wept in the corner of the great hall a year ago, was now Seren's personal attendant, which was a formal title for what was actually a genuine friendship between 2 people who had both spent time near the edges of rooms. She had stopped needing the handkerchief Seren had given her, though she still carried it, for similar reasons. Calla had come to the court in January. Not for ceremony, simply to come. She had brought a gift, a real one chosen with real attention. A new bolt of ivory silk and a card that read in Calla's precise handwriting, "For something made entirely your own, with no borrowed seams." They were building something between them, slowly, with the patience of women who understood that things worth having take honest labor. Aldrich found her in the garden in the late afternoon. He always found her, with that wolfen precision that still made her feel less like she was being located and more like she was being recognized. He sat beside her and looked at the wooden box and at the spool. "You still have it." "Of course I still have it." He picked it up, the small, ordinary, mismatched spool, and turned it in his calloused hands with the same attention he'd given it the night she'd held it up on the dais. "Gold that doesn't ask to be recognized," he said. He'd heard the saying. She'd told him the whole of it, one winter evening over tea. "It waits for the right light," she finished. He set the spool back in the box with care and put his arm around her, and they sat in the rose-gold afternoon light in the budding garden, and Seren Ashvale, who had been wolfless, who had borrowed a torn gown and mended it with the wrong thread, and walked up to a dais in a hall full of people who assumed she didn't matter, held the wooden box in her lap and felt, for the first time in her entire life, not the weight of a saying she couldn't yet understand, but the warmth of one that had come entirely and exactly true. The gold had waited. The light had come. It was enough. It was, in fact, everything.